Welcome back. Time now for the France 24 debate. Now, today we are examining the dramatic events here in France since last Tuesday, when the lower house of parliament gave initial approval to a controversial security bill, which would make it illegal, in many cases, to circulate or publish images of police officers. Well, that bill was heavily criticised by press freedom groups, and the anger intensified when images surfaced of the police beating and racially abusing the music producer Michel Zecler, who is black. Well, that then led to violent clashes on Saturday, with tens of thousands of people taking to the streets of Paris in protest at that new security legislation. There were also protests in about 70 other towns and cities across the country. Well, several people, amongst them dozens of police officers, were injured, and cars, newspaper kiosks, restaurants all set on fire close to the Place de la Bastille here in Paris. Well, the government has now been forced to backtrack on that controversial Article 24, which is going to be completely rewritten in Parliament. Well, here's the spokesperson for President Macron's ruling party.
We are going to propose a complete rewrite of Article 24, which should reflect its dual purpose. This new text will be written within a collective framework involving the three majority groups in Parliament. It now appears evident that the legislative and semantic choices we made have prompted concern from citizens who are worried, who are in fact convinced that it would threaten the right to inform, the right to access information, as well as a legitimate system of checks and balances when it comes to police behavior. The balance that we are trying to achieve with Article 24 has not been unanimously understood. We are aware of that.
Christophe Castaner speaking there. Well, the French Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin has also been facing a grilling today by a parliamentary commission over that new security law. Meanwhile, the 4 French police officers involved in the beating of the music producer have now been charged.
The latest twist and turn in an incident that sent shockwaves through France. Early on Monday morning, 4 police officers involved in the beating of black music producer Michel Zecler were placed under formal investigation for filing a false report and committing willful violence by a person holding public authority. 2 were put behind bars over fears that they could corroborate and pressurize witnesses. Paris prosecutor Rémi Heitz had also called for charges of racial abuse.
They denied using racist language as reported by the victim and corroborated by one of the youths standing behind the lobby door. They denied that the minutes of their first statements were false. They thought that the premises was an access hall open to the public rather than a private lobby. However, they did end up by admitting the blows were unjustified and that they had acted out of fear once inside the lobby.
One of the officers is accused of throwing a tear gas grenade into Zecler's music studio. The CCTV recording of the assault has been widely shared on social media, leading to a groundswell of social pressure so large that on Monday France's parliament agreed to rewrite Article 24 of the National Security Bill. On Saturday, tens of thousands demonstrated nationwide against the bill and police brutality. Protests that ended with violence on both sides, leaving 98 officers injured according to the Interior Ministry. The number of wounded demonstrators is unknown, and at least 1 journalist was hurt.
So what happens next, and how serious a crisis is this for President Emmanuel Macron and his government? Well, here to discuss all that, I'm joined by France 24's Clovis Casselli, who is covering those protests for us throughout the weekend in central Paris. He's here with me in the studio. Welcome to you, Clovis. I'm also joined by Didier Fassin, who's a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and also at the Collège de France. A very warm welcome to you, Professor. And lastly, I'm joined by Pierre-Henri Dumont, who is an MP for Les Républicains, that is the party of the former President Nicolas Sarkozy. Thank you all very much indeed for joining me. Well, Clovis, let me start with you, since you're here with me in the studio. Just tell me a little bit more about the sorts of things you saw when you were covering these events on Saturday.
Well, it was very peaceful at the beginning, Place de la République. There were a lot more people than expected. We're talking tens of thousands of people, a lot more than for the previous rally to protest against this famous, infamous Article 24. And then after a couple of hours of marching, it turned sour with the first fires we saw on Boulevard Beaumarchais just before Place de la Bastille, where all the demonstrators were heading towards. And then when we got to Place de la Bastille, where all those pictures you saw of violence took place, most of them, well, it was cordoned off by police forces in most of the boulevard leading to Bastille. And then you ended up with like a few thousand people, Place de la Bastille, some diehard, let's say, protesters. Those who caused most of the violence ended up being there. They couldn't leave most of Place de la Bastille. There were a couple of roads they could leave from, but they decided to stay there. And very early in the evening, we saw some protesters throw stones, bottles, and also what seemed to be fireworks at police forces. I wasn't there when police forces apparently responded, but we did see quite a lot of violence and animosity and tensions, of course, at Place de la Bastille that day, with, let's say again, not many protesters, some groups of protesters, presumably what we call here the Black Blocs, the Antifa. And also, interesting to see, it reminded me very much of the Yellow Vest protests in some points of the evening. You did have Yellow Vest protesters who turned up, and maybe some of them maybe joined forces with some other violent groups.
Okay, so what you're saying, a lot of people there for a genuine reason. They were genuinely angry about Article 24. Others were there simply to cause trouble. Let me turn to you, Professor Fassin. Where do you think all this anger stems from with regard to Article 24?
Well, to understand this anger, I think you have to at least have a picture of the whole week that you briefly evoked at the beginning of your talk, and situate it in the political context. So, in the range of just 1 week, we had one black producer being brutalized without any reason. He was not committing any violation of the law. We had, and that was during 20 minutes with racist slurs thrown at him. We had a few days before the evacuation of immigrants in the center of Paris on the Place of la République with extreme violence, throwing them from their tents and throwing their tents, images that have shocked beyond the French borders. And we had in the demonstration that was just discussed, this Syrian journalist who has covered the war in Syria and was in Aleppo in particular, and is hurt in a way that he was never hurt when covering this demonstration, in a way that he was never hurt when he was in Syria. And this happens, these three events happens and are visible through these video in a context in which the French president Emmanuel Macron said several times that we're in a country with the rule of law. There cannot be police violence. And the Minister of the Interior, Gérald Darmanin, went so far and so provocatively as saying, when I hear people talk about police violence, I can't breathe. And of course, the expression "I can't breathe" was so evocative of several tragedies in recent months. So you can understand that the fact that these videos have been able to go against the denial by the president, by the Minister of the Interior, by the whole government, that there's no police violence, having an article of the new law that would forbid the use of video and images was something that was obviously an infringement on the right of people to be informed. And the slight inflection that the government gave to this, considering the protest that there was to add that journalists would be able to use these to have these images. But of course, in these cases, these images are not produced by journalists, but by citizens. So that's why you have this anger against something that is obviously trying to add to the denial of what people can see and have seen so many times.
Sure. Okay. So a whole sequence of events, not to mention the fact we're in the context of economic uncertainty, a pandemic, a pretty inflammatory cocktail, as you described there. Let me turn to our third guest, Pierre-Henri Dumont. Sorry to keep you waiting so long, for giving you a chance to speak. You are, of course, an MP. I'd just like to know what your views are on Article 24, and did you vote in favour of it? And if so, why?
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm a member of Les Républicains, so opposition party, but I voted in favor of the law, and I voted in favor of the Article 24. The fact is, what I heard before about Article 24 is, to me, fake news. I was just looking at it again, and this article is not forbidding people to take pictures, to take videos, and to air these pictures or videos on social medias or wherever they want. It's just for these people, it's forbidden after the law will be passed, if this article stays on, to air this video with such comments as, hey, we need to find this guy, do you know his name? We're gonna find where he lives, we're gonna find where his wife works, we're gonna find where his kids are going to school, and we're gonna have huge retaliation on him. That's what is clearly forbidden by this law. We are not going to impeach people to take pictures, to stop people taking videos with this law. That's totally fake news to say that.
Okay, let me turn to you, Professor Fassin. As we just heard there from Pierre-Henri Dumont, this law is about ensuring there aren't witch hunts and campaigns of intimidation against police officers and their families. What about that do you find so unacceptable?
Well, of course, these examples are unacceptable, and there's already, with the law, the existing law, there's the possibility of prosecuting these cases. So you don't need a new law. So if you do a new law, it's not, the law does not give the example that the representative just gave. The law has a very technical language, and this technical language is about repressing the use of images. Again, this possibility of insulting the police or calling for violence against them, first of all, is not so often the case. But when it is, there's the possibility to prosecute them with the current law.
Okay, and what do you make of that rebuttal then, Pierre-Henri Dumont?
Well, we faced some dramas. 2 police officers were killed in Magnanville a few years ago because their identities were leaked on the internet, and they were killed by Islamists because their identities and their address was on Facebook or on Twitter. I don't remember where, but it was on social medias. So the law we had before was not sufficient enough to protect the people who are protecting us. And again, this law is not forbidden to take pictures, to take videos, and to air them. It's just forbidden to say where these people live, to harass them, and to launch some witch hunt on them. So basically, if you want my very profound point of view, I think this part of law is totally ill-written. It shouldn't be on the law of 1881 on press and liberty of the press, but it should be on some penal code. And the fact it was written on it on this part of our legislation on the press is something that was ill understood by our citizens. It was ill understood by our press enterprises. And the fact is, I hope the Senate will rewrite this piece of law to ensure that our police forces will be protected then.
Okay, well, it sounds like they are going to rewrite it one way or the other. Clovis, you were, of course, out on the streets, as we've been saying, on Saturday. You saw that violence. I mean, before things got nasty, did you have a chance to talk to people to gauge what their level of understanding was about Article 24 and what the point of it was?
It's important to say that when you looked at the demonstrators, it wasn't just activists. It was all kinds of protesters, all ages. I saw elderlies, I saw young people, I saw families, people presumably across the political spectrum also, who turned up on the streets because they did not maybe understand this law, or they were against it because they saw it clearly as a way of preventing the press and preventing more generally the public of filming freely the police. Whether that is really the case or not with Article 24, that remains to be seen. But anyway, it does seem that this article will be dropped in the coming days, coming weeks, rewritten by the La République En Marche, the ruling party MPs, possibly. And let's just talk about the timing. The timing is terrible here. You have all these cases of police brutality, perceived police brutality at least, coming out on social media, coming out in the press. You've got President Macron himself saying he was shocked by this video of the black music producer, who saw police on the street, who then went into his music studio in the heart of Paris, only to be followed by policemen who are now under scrutiny, under heavy scrutiny, who might be charged for that. They might leave the police. What has to be said, it was terrible timing, the worst possible timing for the government. The government will tell you this law has been in the making for 2 years. President Macron met with police representatives months ago, told them that something had to be done. Because as the Les Républicains, the centre-right party MP, our guest, was just saying, police forces have come under fire, have had a really difficult time with the various weeks of yellow vest protests on the Champs-Élysées, with terrorist attacks. Honestly, we can say that since 2015, France has been under attack. It's been really tough. Police forces on the front line. But the government did not choose the right time with this bill, or anyway, news. These videos coming out clearly didn't help Macron and the government. And Darmanin's coming under increased pressure, not just from the public, but also from people from his own party, or from La République En Marche party.
Okay. We're going to come back to you in the second half. That's it for the first half of the France 24 debate. Stay with us. Welcome back. It is time now for part 2 of the France 24 debate. Today we're examining the dramatic events of the last 6 days here in France, which began with a vote on a controversial security bill, which would have made it illegal in many cases to circulate or publish images of police officers in action. Well, the anger then intensified when images surfaced of the police beating a black music producer. There were then violent clashes at the weekend, and now the government has been forced to backtrack, and the controversial Article 24 has been put on a back burner. Well, let's kick off by hearing from the head of the police unions here in France.
On a des policiers aujourd'hui. La formation initiale, bof. La formation continue, bof. Le suivi médical, zéro. Le suivi psychologique, on n'en parle même pas. Les commissions hygiène et sécurité, ça n'existe pas. Je suis pas en train de dire qu'attention, ça excuse. Parce que rien ne doit jamais excuser la commission d'un délit ou d'un crime.
Oui, parce qu'habituellement, ce sont les voyous. Pardon.
Jamais
mais
on
actuellement,
excuse. La question, elle est, une fois qu'on a traité cette affaire, est-ce qu'on en fait un fait divers qui sera balayé par un autre, ou est-ce qu'on va vraiment dans le fond du problème et on se dit il y a un vrai problème à l'intérieur de la police nationale?
Okay, so the unions, they're saying it's a lack of resources, a lack of adequate training that's behind all of this. We've been hearing from the French Interior Minister this evening. He's saying that, in fact, that on the whole, the police force is admirable, that obviously there are going to be a couple of bad apples. Here's what he said.
Des actes inqualifiables.
Undescribable actions have been carried out by those who wear the uniform of the Republic. It was the case in the 17th arrondissement of Paris. These people have been suspended. I've asked for their dismissal, and a judicial inquiry is ongoing, which I congratulate myself for. People who have been given the monopoly of legitimate violence and who use force in a disproportionate manner must be sanctioned and have no place in the police force. But individuals don't make a whole. And I will not tolerate attacks on the institution that is the police, which is doing admirable work.
The French Interior Minister speaking there, well, even by the government's own admission, trust between the police and the public has broken down. Let's take a closer look in this report.
Better training is at the heart of the debate on how to improve policing methods. Critics say officers are rushed through basic training like ethics, communication, conflict resolution, de-escalation, and even the use of firearms, as experienced by this journalist who joined their ranks undercover.
J'avais jamais tiré, par exemple, j'avais jamais utilisé d'arme à feu avant. Et en 3 mois, on m'a donné une habilitation pour utiliser une arme sur la voie publique. Voilà, c'est expéditif. Vous avez trop de manque dans la formation.
In recent years, police unions have said officers are too isolated on the ground. They have often had to take crucial decisions on their own, like when to fire rubber balls at protesters when demonstrations get out of control. After a first reform, officers have to consult with their supervisor before they shoot. Soon, more commanding officers could be deployed with their units.
Ça fait partie de nos revendications d'en effet revoir ce taux d'encadrement à la hausse pour permettre d'avoir justement un peu plus de gradés, on va dire, encadrants. Et après, je pense qu'encore une fois, je pense que les mots importants, c'est la transmission aussi d'un savoir-faire, aussi d'une attitude, aussi d'une valeur républicaine.
Critics say authorities need greater transparency to rebuild trust. Body cameras should be widely used by next year, but for now, their use is limited.
Les caméras piétons, elles là aussi, elles ne fonctionnent pas. On l'a vu, puisque le logiciel ne fonctionnait pas. Et puis c'est une caméra qui est subjective, et elle peut être mise en œuvre uniquement par le fonctionnaire de police à son bon vouloir.
Some cities abroad, like in the US, have seen a drop of 80% in the number of complaints against police since they've started using these cameras.
Okay, well, here to discuss all that, I'm joined here in the studio by Clovis Casali, who's been covering the protests for us at the weekend. I'm also joined by Professor Didier Fassin at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, also at the Collège de France. And last but not least, Pierre-Henri Dumont, who's an MP for Les Républicains. Let me start with you, if you'll allow me, Mr. Dumont. Clearly, morale in the ranks of the French police force is low. We got that impression quite clearly from the union member we heard from. We got that impression from the report we just saw. Do you think that the calls for Article 24 came from the ranks of the police to begin with? And if so, why?
Yes, obviously. I mean, no one says the contrary, that this idea of Article 24, at least what's behind, is not coming from police forces and police unions. The fact is, for years now, the police officers are on the streets fighting against terrorism, fighting against separatism now, fighting against the leak and the problems on secularism. And we've got more and more people on the streets every week. Last year, we've got every weekend people on the streets with the yellow vests. So police officers are day and night on the streets, and they are exhausted. They are exhausted because they are doing whatever they can. They are not trained enough. They have no cars enough in a good shape to pursue the bad fellows. And basically, they are totally exhausted. And sometimes, you know, when you're exhausted, when you are too many on the streets, you cannot be self-confident enough to take the good decisions. And maybe that's what happened.
Professor Fassin, clearly, I think everyone agrees that you know, there are issues in the ranks of the police force. People, as we've just heard, there are exhausted. The officers feel that they're not being given the support they need. They don't feel they're getting the remuneration they deserve. And that's quite a recurrent theme in the French public sector. You hear the same thing said by doctors, nurses, members of the fire brigade. I just want to sort of focus a bit more on the police. I mean, do you think this is just a question of inadequate training, or do you think the police here in France is no worse than in any other country? There are always going to be bad apples, because that was the argument of the Interior Minister.
So first of all, I agree with my predecessor, the representative Dumont, on the fact, and people who have spoken before, on the fact that the police are exhausted, and they are exhausted in particular because they have been given tasks that they know are completely ineffective but are purely performative. So they are put in train stations or in front of monuments that are supposed to be at risk, and they know that this is not what they should do. This is not helpful. So they do more hours than they should do. They are not paid for these hours. They are not valued for their work. So I entirely agree that there's a problem in the recruitment, in the training, in the police academy, and then in the follow-up, in particular, the sanctions. Sanctions could mean rewards for those who do a good work, and punishment for those who are who have this kind of misbehavior. But we know that it is exactly the opposite that happens. There's impunity for misbehavior, and there's punishment for those who denounce this behavior. I spent 15 months going out with the police in the streets, in cars, or in foot, and I've seen and I've heard them, and I've seen how this happened. So I agree that there's these problems with the police, but at the same time, the institution. That's where I would completely disagree with what was said before by one of the person that were interviewed. That it is not the institution. Of course, it is the institution. When you have an institution that denies these problems, that does not try to find solution to them, that does not reward those who do good things and punish the others.
To be fair, Professor, I mean, it was about the timing more than anything about what happened. It was very unfortunate timing, what happened to that black music producer last week. I mean, every police force around the world
it's not a question. It is not a question of timing, because in fact, what we have today is the visibilization and explosion, in a way, of something that has happened over several decades and has accelerated over the last few years. That is the extension of the prerogatives of the police that has been continuous under the pressure of the unions. And that is something that the former Minister of the Interior told me, the difficulty to reform the police because of the pressure of the union, and you referred to it before. So this is something that culminated when the state of emergency that we had after the terrorist attacks was transformed into legal measures in the normal law. So now we have the exception has become the rule, to use a famous phrase, and this is this situation that as today gives this reaction both from the police and from the population.
But don't you agree with what the Interior Minister said, which was this is an example of, okay, on the whole, there are good cops out there, but yes, there are always going to be some bad cops or some bad apples, or however you want to phrase it. Don't you think that's the bottom line here? And this is just an unfortunate example, a horrific example, and the timing was obviously catastrophic.
It is not, and it is not the way to think about it. Of course, I've known police officers who were extremely respectful of their public, and I've known violent, brutal, racist, and sometimes sadistic police officers. I've known both of them in 15 months, and everyone in the police know that. But that's where the question is not the individual police officers, it is the institution which has the responsibility to deal with these problems, both at the level of recruitment, training, and sanction. Everywhere in the rest of Europe, police officers or police experts look at France and they don't understand what's happening in our country. Our country has one of the most violent police in the Western countries of Europe. And this is there's a different way to do in the confrontation. Of course, there is delinquency. Of course, there is crime, but the way the police intervene very often aggravates the thing. As one of high official in the police administration told me once, he said, when I send them these special units called BAC, Brigade Anti-Criminalité, Anti-Crime Brigade. When I send them, I know that the risk is that they will make the situation worse than it was before. So this is what you have to take into account, the role of the institution, and not the question of bad apples and good cops. Of course, you have both, but the role of the institution is to treat these problems.
Okay, just before we move on to the next segment of discussion and look at the sort of the political fallout, I just want to ask you as well, Pierre-Henri Dumont, for any comments you might have on what our professor was just saying there.
Well, I don't think that the police is systematically racist or violent. I don't like either the way the aggression, the assault on Michel Zecler was made. The problem on this assault was not that the guy was a black music producer. The problem of this assault was because he was assaulted, not because he was black, but because it was further legitimate violence. The French society is getting more and more violent prior to the violence of the police officers. If you take a look at how we cannot demonstrate peacefully right now in France because we've got black blocs, because we've got very extremist leftists going into demonstrations and trying to destroy the credibility of these demonstrations right now. It's a catastrophe because demonstrate is guaranteed by our constitution in France. So I really believe that nowadays we've got a more and more violent society, and the only way to answer to this violence within the French society, for some different reasons and backgrounds of the people who are committed these violences, is for the police to use the legitimate violence they've got because they are the police of the French Republic.
Clovis.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one thing the MP was saying. The Michel Zecler, who was assaulted, did repeatedly say that he was victim of racist abuse, police officers using the N-word against him. So let's just point that out. There is a feeling among second, third generation French people here in the French suburbs, a strong feeling that there is some kind of racism within the police. Of course, it's not systemic, but there is a thing in France called le contrôle d'identité, which is ID check. It doesn't exist in every country in the world. And some people in the French suburbs feel that they're systematically controlled 2, 3, 4 times a day sometimes by police forces asking for their ID papers. And that might make you feel slightly different from other
and it creates
French
mistrust
citizens.
as well, doesn't it?
Indeed. And another point that's important, a lot of the French people, or some people in France believe that the IGPN, the police of the police, the forces who are supposed to control or oversee police and that seized when there are cases of suspected police brutality. Well, when you look at the figures, only a handful of the cases actually end up with police forces, police officers being prosecuted or found guilty. So you've got all these people who are saying, I was victim of police brutality, who hope that through the IGPN, these police officers will be found guilty, and they rarely are found guilty. And we're just talking about the people who do press charges. many of us probably don't even go to the police saying that they were victim of not necessarily brutality, but ill conduct, let's say.
Okay, let's move on from the discussion specifically about the police and go back to Article 24. And I just want to ask you, Clovis, because you've been following the story for several days now. Just tell us what's been happening in Parliament and what's been the political fallout.
Well, it's been terrible for the government, for President Macron, because you've got this Article 24. He and the government convinced the La République En Marche MPs to vote in favour of this law. Some of them didn't want to. They were convinced to do so. They passed the law in the lower chamber, the National Assembly. Then Jean Castex, the Prime Minister, and presumably the President Emmanuel Macron say, we're going to create a commission to review this Article 24 that's so controversial. Then you've got the MPs and the President of the National Assembly, Richard Ferrand, saying, you know what, you can't just make us vote this. We vote this in Parliament, and then you decide to rewrite it completely. This is absolutely wrong. So you've got the left wing, the centre-left, the Green Party, all the left, and even now the La République En Marche, or some of the people at La République En Marche, turning against this law, or at least against the government's attitude in this, and especially Gérald Darmanin. Gérald Darmanin is a politician who was a rising star of the late UMP party. We've got a guest from Les Républicains, which is the new UMP party. So he knows Mr. Darmanin extremely well. Darmanin used to be from those ranks. He was transferred, let's say, to President Macron, and now Darmanin is criticized by a lot of people in France, the left wing, but also people from La République En Marche. And I can tell you the Interior Minister is having a very tough time. And it is said behind closed doors that President Macron himself is extremely infuriated by the attitude that Darmanin's taken, who's showing himself a bit like a new Sarkozy, firmly behind the police, be strong, be hard, be always backing police forces. And it looks like it's backfiring.
Let me turn to Mr. Dumont, since we've been talking about you, Pierre-Henri Dumont. Do you agree, first of all, with what my colleague has been saying? And do you think Mr. Darmanin is going to survive this?
It's not up to me to say that. I mean, it's in France, it's to Mr. Macron to say that he still trusts Mr. Darmanin to ensure security of France. The fact is, he betrayed the center-right party, UMP, and then Les Républicains, to join Mr. Macron to become his minister for budget first and then for interior affairs. So basically, he's no longer a member of Les Républicains. He's not a member of the right-wing political party. He's a member of the centrist party of France, of Mr. Macron. And his future as a minister is not a big deal to me.
Let me turn to you then, Professor Fassin. I mean, is President Macron and his party, are they going to recover politically from all of this? Is this just a bad week, or is this more than just a bad week?
Well, it is probably a bad week, but a bad week that is inscribed in a very clear shift of the government, and in particular of President Emmanuel Macron. You probably remember that when he was campaigning to become president, he was arguing that he was neither left nor right, that he was above parties. And that's why Mr. Dumont just said that he was at the center, or he was a centrist. But he's not a centrist anymore, and his government is not a centrist government anymore. During the first 2 years of his term, President Macron shifted his social policies and fiscal policies, economic policies, to the right, which was what you could expect from someone coming from the banking world. And this was not a surprise. But in the last year and a half, he has turned to the right also on issues of what we call les pouvoirs régaliens, in particular issues of security. And so what we see now is exactly this the last sign, and probably not there will be others, but the last sign up to now of this shift to the right, because that's where he believes that he can win the next presidential election. He knows that if he can be the presidential candidate against Marine Le Pen, who is at the far right, the right, the center, and part of the left will vote for him, and that will be like last time, and he will win. So his calculation is to go to the right.
A calculated move by the president ahead of the next election. Clovis, so we're running very short of time. Just to wrap this up for us, where do we head to from here?
Well, first, I'd like to say that Mr. Fassin's argument is a lot of people believe that Emmanuel Macron is going to the right to be able to face Marine Le Pen in the second round. When you look at the government, Jean Castex is prime minister, was a former advisor of Nicolas Sarkozy. His former prime minister, Édouard Philippe, was from l'UMP Les Républicains. So what is he trying to do? Is he trying to be the left-wing figure in the government, or the centre-left-wing figure in the government, and have a government kind of mixed, and his number two, the prime minister, a right-wing figure? It's very difficult to say. What can be sure is that Emmanuel Macron at first said to Darmanin, go with your strategy, show that you're firmly behind the police forces, and that's also with his discours au murau, the law on separatism. It was also about that. It was also about showing that the French Republic, was standing strong against separatism, against fundamentalism, and against anyone who attacked the police. So he took that stance, and now he's kind of having to change his mind because you see everything that's happening, these videos, he can't afford to have a Black Lives Matter happen here in France.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. You've had the last word. As we've been saying, a week is a very long time in politics. Clearly 6 days is even longer, perhaps. Clovis Casali, thank you very much indeed for that. I'd also like to thank Professor Didier Fassin and last but not least, Pierre-Henri Dumont. Thank you all very much indeed for speaking to us. That was the France 24 debate.